What on God's green earth is going on here? Why are there tower pets with no person attached to them? And why can't I step on them and they just teleport above me? So in this video, I'm going to talk about all of the enemies that require you to get the logbook before you can spawn them in independently into sandbox mode, even if you have the Adobe Mode Game Pass. Now the Adobe Mode Game Pass, it sort of allows you to bypass the logbook requirement for most enemies before you can spawn them into sandbox mode. For other people, for the regular normies, you have to get the logbook before you can spawn it into sandbox mode. However, this is not the case actually for some enemies. You need to have its logbook, even if you do have admin mode before you can spawn it in. And so in some cases, you need both admin mode and you need the logbook, because the enemy that you unlock is a legacy enemy. All legacy enemies, they require admin mode before you can spawn it in, but these enemies also require the logbook before you can spawn them in, because they're not enabled by default in the legacy section. But first, an enemy which you cannot get the logbook for and you only can get through admin mode, well, sandbox mode. So as you can see here, there is a super slime logbook which you can get from Polluted Wastelands 2. However, there is no slime logbook. However, if you go to the legacy section and you scroll all the way down to S, you'll find a slime enemy, which is different to the super slime, or radioactive slime as it is called internally. So radioactive slime, slime. If you spawn both of them in, they're different enemies. One is the slime, radioactive slime here, and one is just the slime. They are different enemies. One has 10,000 health, one has 8,000 health. However, you cannot get the slime logbook. It just does not exist. Well, it does exist, but since the slime does not naturally spawn into the game naturally, because the slime that spawns into nuclear mode or Polluted Wastelands 2 is the radioactive slime internally, it means that the internal enemy called the slime cannot spawn in. You cannot get its logbook. You can spawn it into admin mode. In fact, it's sandbox mode you can spawn it into. However, because it's a legacy enemy, you require the admin mode game pass before you can spawn it in. This therefore makes the slime the only sandbox mode exclusive enemy, and by extension admin mode exclusive enemy, that you cannot even get the logbook for. Sure, in some cases there are admin mode exclusive enemies such as the Enraged, but you can actually get its logbook, well, kinda. Oh, and there's one more enemy, that being the Enraged enemy, because this enemy you can only spawn into sandbox mode, and it doesn't appear anywhere else in the modern game. But a modern Enraged does exist. I mean, actually, so does a modern Slime, actually. But for wiki purposes, we've included the Legacy Enraged within the modern Enraged. And to my knowledge, the Slime and the Legacy Enraged are the only two enemies which appear in sandbox mode only. The other enemies that I'm about to mention appeared elsewhere in the game before appearing in sandbox mode. So the first enemy that you require to get its logbook for before you can spawn it in is the enemy internally called Tutorial Boss, but everyone knows it as the Dummy Boss. Yes, this enemy does not appear in the sandbox mode at all, not even as like its own game mode. Tutorial mode, while the tutorial map does exist, tutorial mode doesn't. Therefore meaning that to get the Dummy Boss spawned into sandbox mode, you require its logbook, because it doesn't naturally appear in the enemy section, even if it is a modern enemy. Next, all of the Operation Ice enemies, they do not naturally appear in admin mode. You need to get its logbook, which you can only have gotten from the Operation Ice event, which has ended. So that includes, say, the Cold Mist, the Crying Angel, the Deep Freeze, the Frost Hero, the Frost Hunter, the Frost Invader, the Frost Mage, Frost Mystery, Frost Necromancer, Frost Ravager, Frost Spirit, Frost Undead, Frozen, etc, etc. Also the Frost Spawner, but I don't have the Frost Spawner, which is the only logbook I don't have, apart from, well, currently right now I don't have the Nerd Duck logbook, but I should get it soon. Now actually, it's the case where, for the Frost Necromancer, it's actually called the Roblox Necromancer, because the Roblox Necromancer and the Frost Necromancer share the same enemy. On its display name, the Frost Necromancer has been changed over to the Roblox Necromancer, but internally it's still called the Frost Necromancer. So if you try and attempt to spawn it in, yeah, as you can see, it is the Fallen Necromancer. I spawned in the wrong thing. Shit. So, Frost Necromancer. Spawn it in, and it's called the Roblox Necromancer. The developers reused the Frost Necromancer for the Hunt Mega Edition event, which, by the way, you also need to get their logbooks for before you can spawn it into sandbox mode. So this includes the likes of the Roblox General, Roblox Guard, Roblox Seeker, Roblox Soul, Roblox Undead, Roblox Warrior, and randomly the Redcliffe Traitor. These enemies do have differing stats from when they're seen in the event. For example, the Frost Spirit never had 100,000 health in the event. It's something to do with like default health of the Frost Spirit and changing it depending on what mode it is in, at least within Operation Ice, and because you can't activate Operation Ice enemies or Operation Ice game modes, it therefore means that the Frost Spirit will always have 100,000 health in sandbox mode. Next, the current event, the Ducky Revenge event. All of its enemies, you require its logbook before you can spawn it into sandbox mode. Furthermore, a game mode which people probably forget that you could actually get logbooks for, that's the April Fool's 2025 event. Well, also the April Fool's 2024 event, except for one major difference. You cannot get the toilet boss logbook because it never naturally spawns into toilet mode in 2025, therefore meaning that you're stuck with the armored toilet, the arrow, high show speed as the streamer, as seen here, and stuff like the PNG bots 1, 2, and 3, and 4, which, by the way, these are developers' cats. I've talked about this in the past, but yes, some of these are developers' cats, some of these are meme cats. Then we have the really weird case of the Warden, a legacy enemy which looks very similar to the Templar. In fact, they're basically nearly the same. In fact, I think they are the same, except no, one's coloured slightly differently. Now, the way the whitelist system works for enemies that do not require the logbook is that it requires the game modes that's given to you in admin mode. So all of these game modes plus the legacy survival game modes. If an enemy appears in any of these game modes naturally, so not spawned in by a boss, not spawned in by any other means, it has to spawn in naturally in these game modes, then it is whitelisted. However, the Warden is a rare enemy that appears in hardcore mode, but doesn't appear in any of the previous legacy game modes. While it does appear in Fallen mode, it only appears through the enemy's beta modifier, and because the base wave does not consider an enemy's beta modifiers, it only considers a legacy modifier, it means that you require to get the Warden's logbook before you can spawn it into admin mode. Now, it's actually the case where the developers have actually enabled a whitelist of enemies from hardcore mode, so that includes enemies like the Void Reaver and the Vindicator. So for example, the Molten boss, apparently you required its logbook for the longest while before you were able to spawn it into sandbox mode or admin mode. However, it was only recently where the developers updated it so you can spawn in the Molten boss without its logbook. However, for whatever reason, they just missed out the Templar. I don't know why. Sorry, not the Templar. I keep mixing up the Templar and the Warden because they're just so similar. No, it's the Warden enemy that for some reason isn't in this whitelist. And it seems like through some investigation that me and Menton have done, it seems like the Warden is the only hardcore mode exclusive enemy that you need its logbook for before you can spawn it into sandbox mode. However, there are some enemies in the game where they don't naturally appear in any of these game modes mentioned here, so you actually do require their logbooks. And in fact, it includes some common enemies, including the Breaker 3 and the Breaker. Now, this is because the Breaker 4 and the Breaker 2s, they appear naturally in said game mode, so they appear naturally. In fact, they appear naturally in all game modes, I think, from easy mode all the way to Fallen mode. However, the Breaker and the Breaker 3s do not appear naturally in these game modes. The Breaker 3s actually appear naturally in Polluted Wastelands 2, and the Breaker and the Breaker 3s also appear naturally in Badlands 2. However, that doesn't count for our purposes. This would also include the Skeleton, both the Legacy and the Modern variant. Yeah, for all intents and purposes, these are actually different. The Skeleton here, the Legacy variant, 60 health. This one, 10 health. Another enemy that this would apply to is the Molten Demon, which doesn't naturally appear in the Molten mode, and in Fallen mode there are actually a couple of enemies, that being the Fallen Skeleton, which doesn't naturally appear in Fallen mode, and the Necrotic Skeleton, which also does not naturally appear in Fallen mode. It does naturally appear in Badlands 2, but again, that doesn't count. Now, next are some Pizza Party enemies. Now, the whitelist, which applied to Pizza Party enemies, was applied in December 2024, which means that you don't need the Wox the Fox logbook to spawn in Wox the Fox. However, ever since Pizza Party was reworked, it meant that the enemies that appeared in Pizza Party were not on any whitelist for admin mode, requiring the use of logbooks to spawn these in. So this includes the Citizen Plush, the Clown, the Demon, the Ghost, the Colbert Guard, the Knight, the Marionettes, the Executioner, the Reaper, the Sin, the Sock Puppet, and the Voodoo Doll. Same also applies to Badlands 2, but it returned less enemies when it was reworked, so that only included the Conjurer, the Giant Skeleton, and the Withered. As for Polluted Wastelands 2, it returned only 4 enemies, however, they have different internal names. In Polluted Wastelands 2, the Hex Corpse and the Hex Corpse Upper, they're called the Splitter and the Split. In Sandbox mode, they have different names. They have their internal names. Another is the Hex Weaver. It's actually called the Mutagenic Blight, and is famously known as the Mutagenic Blight because it's just too OP. And finally is a Legacy enemy which returns, which I actually forgot about. The Overgrowth is an enemy from the Solar Eclipse event. Kind of surprising that this returns, given the fact that it does have old animations, and it has an old model from 2021. The next are enemies exclusive to events which require another logbook. And in fact, these are the oldest enemies in the game which have not been updated. So that includes the clown, that includes the demon, that includes the ghost, and includes the reaper. These enemies have not been updated since they were first added in 2019. The Halloween 2019 event are the oldest enemies in the game which haven't been changed. Now, that being said though, they don't have any faces due to an update. Now, you can get these enemies through Pizza Party logbooks with the enemies that share the same name at it. So for example, to get the Legacy Clown from 2019, you need the Modern Clown logbook. Similar for the Demon, and by the way, these also do not have any faces either because of the update. Now, the Reaper is an interesting case because this is the enemy from Trick or Threat Town and not Nightmare Carnival. This is because the one in Trick or Threat Town actually superseded the one that appears in Nightmare Carnival. The reason why this does not apply to the Clown or the Demon is because they don't have a Trick or Threat Town appearance. In other words, these enemies have not been superseded by an enemy which could have appeared in the Halloween 2020 event. Now, meanwhile, for the Ghost, this version is from the Solar Eclipse event because it made an appearance in Nightmare Carnival, Trick or Threat Town, and the Solar Eclipse event. And because the Solar Eclipse event is the most modern of the three, it means that, yes, this is the Solar Eclipse version. But actually, it is only the Clown and the Demon which are the oldest enemies from 2019, since the other two have been updated since. Another category of enemy which this applies to is the Frost Invasion enemies. So that's the like of the Crying Angel, the Deep Freeze, the Frost Spirits, the Frost Ravager, the Frozen, the Frost Necromancer, Frost Mystery, etc, etc. Now, this also applies to two Violent Night enemies which, thinking about it, should have appeared in the Frost Invasion event, and in fact one of them did. The Snow Golem actually appeared in the Frost Invasion event, however it actually made a return in Cold Ambush, which is the Violent Night event, therefore meaning that the Violent Night event superseded that version. Meanwhile, as for the Snowman, it had a version in the Village of Despair, the 2019 Christmas event, but since it had a version in Cold Ambush, the Violent Night event, that one superseded the version from 2019, therefore meaning that there are no Christmas 2019 enemies in Tower Defense Simulator which you can spawn in, differing to the Halloween 2019 event enemies because there are two, the Clown and the Demon. And finally, yes, you have the whole smattering of the Duck Hunt event enemies, which includes one enemy, suspiciously, does not use its legacy icon. No, for some reason, the Explosive Ducky uses the modern icon, even though if you spawn it in, yes, this is the legacy Ducky icon. Oh, hey, Osama. Yeah, some of the enemies are broken. For some reason, it's the modern enemy that's broken, not the legacy enemies. I don't know why.